If you want to see the exact guide I put together on building a real relationship with an authorized dealer from your very first visit, there's a walkthrough on my channel with the real details. No guesswork, just what actually works. Thanks for watching. Let's talk about marketing, because Rolex's approach here reinforces the same underlying philosophy through yet another channel, compared to many luxury competitors who rely heavily on constant, highly visible advertising campaigns, celebrity endorsement deals renewed and refreshed constantly, and a steady stream of new product announcements. Rolex has historically taken a notably more restrained approach, associating itself with long-term brand ambassador relationships in sports like tennis, golf, and sailing, sponsorships that emphasize tradition, precision, and understated prestige rather than the kind of splashy, frequent advertising blitzes common elsewhere in luxury marketing. This restraint isn't an absence of marketing spend. Rolex spends considerably on these sponsorship relationships, but it's a different kind of marketing, one that reinforces exclusivity and permanence rather than urgency or trend-driven desirability, aligned with a brand that wants to be understood as a multi-generational heirloom rather than a seasonal fashion purchase, which in turn supports the entire distribution philosophy. A brand built around patience and long-term relationships doesn't need aggressive, high-volume advertising pushing immediate purchases through as many channels as possible. Let me walk through a concrete scenario, because seeing how this system plays out for two different people navigating it makes the mechanics much clearer than discussing them abstractly. A man we'll call Adrian walks into a Rolex authorized dealer for the first time, having saved for a specific steel sport model he's wanted for years. Cash ready, prepared to pay full retail price immediately. The salesperson is polite but direct. That specific model has a waiting list currently estimated at somewhere between 1 and 3 years, with no guaranteed timeline, and Adrian's name can be added to a list. Though the salesperson is candid that walk-in customers with no prior purchase history at that specific store often wait considerably longer than the estimate suggests. Frustrated, Adrian looks at gray market listings online that same evening and finds the exact watch, brand new, available immediately, at roughly 40% above the retail price he'd been prepared to pay in the store. He faces a choice that thousands of would-be Rolex buyers face constantly: wait an unknown, potentially multi-year period for the official price, or pay a substantial premium for immediate gratification through the secondary market, a choice that exists only because of the deliberate gap Rolex's distribution strategy has created between supply and demand. Now, compare that to a different buyer, a woman we'll call Camille, who has shopped at the same authorized dealer for 6 years, initially purchasing a modest women's Rolex model for a milestone birthday, then returning periodically for servicing, for a strap adjustment, occasionally browsing without buying anything at all, building a relationship with a specific salesperson who remembers her name and her collection every time she visits. When she mentions, in passing during a routine visit, that she's interested in a specific, currently hard to get model, the salesperson notes the interest without making any promises. 8 months later, she receives a phone call letting her know a single unit of that exact watch has arrived and is being held for her at retail price. No waiting list formality required beyond the relationship she'd built over years of smaller, unrelated interactions. Camille didn't do anything that violated any written policy, and Rolex would likely describe this as simply rewarding a loyal, established customer relationship. But the practical effect is the same system that frustrated Adrian working, almost invisibly, in Camille's favor, precisely because she'd invested years in a relationship most first time. Walk-in customers never have the opportunity or patience to build. There's a third perspective worth adding, from inside the dealer network itself rather than from either type of customer. A former authorized dealer sales associate who left the industry and discussed the experience candidly in a watch collecting community interview without naming her specific former employer, described the internal allocation process as considerably more subjective than either Rolex's official policy language or most customers ever realize. She noted that individual sales associates often had meaningful discretion over which waiting list customers actually received an allocation when a shipment arrived, discretion that could be influenced by factors having little to do with how long someone had technically been waiting, including whether a customer had been pleasant to work with, whether they'd purchased other items in the meantime, and in some cases, frankly, whether the salesperson simply liked them personally. She was candid that this created real inconsistency and occasional unfairness within the system. describing it as something closer to a personal favor economy layered on top of an official corporate waiting list policy that, on paper, sounded far more procedural and even handed than it actually functioned in daily practice at the store level. Let's talk about why this entire system has proven so durable, because it would be easy to assume artificial scarcity strategies eventually collapse once customers grow frustrated enough to simply buy from a competitor instead, and that hasn't happened here at anywhere near the scale you'd expect. Part of the answer is that Rolex's brand recognition operates at a scale few competitors can match, meaning frustrated demand doesn't reliably convert into lost sales to another brand the way it would in most other product categories. A customer unwilling to wait years for a specific Rolex model is far more likely to buy a different Rolex model, or simply pay the gray market premium than to switch brands entirely. This gives Rolex a level of insulation from the normal competitive pressure that would force most companies to ease supply constraints in response to customer frustration, because the frustration rarely translates into the kind of lost revenue that would show up as a warning sign in ordinary competitive markets. One historical episode shows this restraint isn't a recent phenomenon tied only to today's social media-driven hype cycles, because Rolex maintained a similar strategic discipline during one of the most disruptive periods the entire watch industry has ever faced. In the 1970s and 1980s, the widespread adoption of quartz movement technology, far cheaper to produce and more accurate than traditional mechanical movements, devastated much of the Swiss watch industry in what's widely referred to as the Quartz Crisis, a period during which a substantial share of established Swiss watchmakers either collapsed entirely or were forced into aggressive consolidation and cost-cutting to survive against a flood of inexpensive, highly accurate quartz alternatives, many from Japanese manufacturers. Rolex did produce some quartz models during this period, but the company notably did not abandon its core identity as a mechanical watchmaker, nor did it chase the low-cost, high-volume quartz market the way some competitors attempted to in order to survive the disruption. This decision, maintaining a mechanical-first identity and a premium, restricted distribution model throughout an industry-wide crisis that was actively punishing companies for exactly that kind of stubbornness, could easily have been a fatal miscalculation. Instead, once the initial quartz disruption settled and mechanical watches repositioned in the market as heritage, craftsmanship, driven objects rather than simply the most accurate way to tell time, Rolex's consistency throughout the crisis reinforced precisely the kind of long-term brand positioning that made its later scarcity strategy credible. A brand that had chased short-term survival through cheap quartz mass production during the crisis would have had a much harder time decades later convincing customers that its watches were worth waiting years for at a premium price, because the brand's own history would have already demonstrated a willingness to prioritize volume over identity the moment real pressure arrived. One useful contrast is worth drawing here, because it shows this outcome wasn't inevitable for every watch brand facing similar demand dynamics. Several other watch brands, both in the luxury tier and in more accessible price categories, have pursued the opposite strategy over the decades, expanding distribution aggressively, embracing constant discounting through department stores and online retailers, and pursuing volume growth as a primary strategic goal. Some of these brands achieved significant sales volume this way, but industry analysts and watch collectors have widely observed that this kind of expansive, discount-friendly distribution strategy tends to correlate with reduced long-term brand prestige and, in the secondary market, resale values that track much closer to, or even below, original retail price rather than the sustained or appreciating resale premiums seen on Rolex's most restricted models. This isn't a coincidence, it's close to the direct, predictable outcome of choosing volume and accessibility over the kind of restricted, relationship-based distribution model Rolex has maintained, illustrating that the scarcity strategy isn't merely compatible with strong resale value, it's arguably a primary cause of it. Here's a 6-part protocol worth understanding whether you're actually trying to buy a Rolex someday or simply want to understand the mechanics the next time the topic comes up. Rolex is not a public company. It has no shareholders, no quarterly earnings calls, no stock ticker, no board answering to investors demanding growth this quarter versus last. The entire company is owned by a private foundation, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, established by the company's own founder so that Rolex would never have to answer to outside financial pressure the way almost every other major consumer brand on earth does. This single structural fact explains more about why you can't just walk into any jewelry store and buy a Rolex than almost anything else about the brand, because every publicly traded luxury company on the planet faces relentless pressure to grow revenue year over year, which almost always means expanding distribution, opening more stores, selling through more channels, reaching more customers. Rolex faces none of that pressure. There is no earnings call where an analyst asks why the company didn't authorize more dealers this quarter. There is no stock price that drops if unit sales don't climb. The foundation exists to sustain the watchmaking business and fund charitable work, not to maximize shareholder return. And that one difference in corporate structure is the root cause of almost every strange, seemingly self-defeating distribution decision the company has made for decades. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. If you want to buy a new Rolex today, you cannot simply order one online from Rolex directly for most models, a policy the company held to with remarkable stubbornness for decades after nearly every other watch brand on earth had embraced e-commerce. You cannot buy one at most jewelry stores. Only a specific, carefully vetted, deliberately limited network of authorized dealers carries new Rolex watches at all. And even walking into one of those approved stores with cash in hand and asking for a popular model, a steel Daytona, a GMT Master, a Submariner in the right configuration will very often get you a polite explanation that the watch isn't available, that there's a waiting list, that the dealer doesn't know when or if one will arrive, sometimes stretching into years for the most sought after references. Meanwhile, that exact same watch is often available immediately on the secondary market from a private seller or a licensed reseller at a price sometimes tens of thousands of dollars above what Rolex itself charges for it new. This is, by any conventional business logic, insane. A company that could sell more watches at higher prices immediately to willing buyers is choosing not to. Understanding why reveals one of the most deliberate, most carefully maintained scarcity strategies in all of global retail. My name is Alex, and I spend a strange amount of time reading watch industry trade publications and, for this video specifically, digging through court filings from dealer termination lawsuits, because it turns out some of the clearest evidence of how tightly Rolex controls its distribution network comes from authorized dealers who got kicked out of it and sued over the terms. Here's what we're covering today: the corporate ownership structure that frees Rolex from the growth pressure nearly every other major brand operates under, and why that structural difference matters more than almost anything else in explaining the company's behavior. The actual mechanics of the authorized dealer network, how a jewelry store earns the right to sell Rolex at all, and the strict contractual terms that govern exactly what that dealer can and cannot do once approved. The deliberate, self-imposed limit on production volume, because unlike most scarcity stories in luxury retail, part of this one is genuinely about manufacturing capacity, not manufactured illusion. The waiting list system and why it exists even for customers standing in the store ready to pay full retail price in cash. And the gray market economy that's emerged around all of this. An entire secondary industry built on the gap between what Rolex charges and what people are actually willing to pay. This isn't a video telling you not to buy a Rolex or that the brand is some kind of scam. The watches themselves involve genuine engineering and craftsmanship that's well documented and widely respected within the industry. This is a video about the distribution strategy itself because it's one of the most unusual and most deliberately maintained systems in all of consumer retail. And understanding it changes how you think about that waiting list the next time someone mentions being on one. Quick thing before we get into it, I put together a free guide walking through exactly how the authorized dealer waiting list system actually works, what builds real priority with a dealer versus what doesn't, based on interviews with dealers and collectors who've navigated it successfully. Links in the description. I only ask for an email to send you the guide. Picture an exclusive embassy system where a handful of specific buildings around the world are authorized to issue a particular nation's passport, and every other building, no matter how official it looks, cannot. The nation itself doesn't need every building to issue passports to remain powerful or desirable. In fact, the opposite. The fewer buildings that can do it, the more significant each one becomes, and the more scrutiny gets applied to anyone trying to open a new one. Losing that authorization isn't like losing a supplier relationship in ordinary retail. It's closer to losing diplomatic status entirely. a complete severing of the ability to participate in that system at all, with no partial version available. This is close to a literal description of how Rolex treats its authorized dealer network. Being authorized is not a simple wholesale relationship where a store buys inventory and resells it at whatever markup the market allows. It's a tightly controlled, revocable privilege, and the company that grants it has structured the entire system so that it needs the dealers considerably less than the dealers need it. Let's talk about how a jewelry store actually becomes a Rolex authorized dealer, because the process itself tells you almost everything about the power dynamic involved. Rolex does not run an open application process the way most brands would for a wholesale account. Becoming authorized has historically required an extended, often multi-year relationship building process, frequently starting with a store already carrying other prestigious watch brands, demonstrating specific standards of retail presentation, security, staff training, and financial stability, all before Rolex's regional representatives will even seriously consider extending an offer. Multiple watch industry retrospectives and dealer interviews over the years have described this as closer to being invited into a private club than applying for a standard business account, with some stores reportedly waiting a decade or more, cultivating the relationship the entire time before ever receiving authorization. Once authorized, the terms of the relationship are, by all accounts from dealers who've discussed it publicly or in legal filings, extremely restrictive. Authorized dealers are contractually prohibited from discounting Rolex watches below the price the company sets, a policy the company enforces aggressively since a permitted, systemic pattern of discounting would undermine the exact price, stability, and prestige positioning that makes an authorized Rolex dealership valuable to hold in the first place. Dealers are also, in various documented cases, restricted in how they can advertise Rolex watches, what other brands they can display Rolex alongside, and how they present the watches physically in store, none of which is left to the dealer's own retail judgment the way it typically would be for most wholesale relationships. Here's the part that reveals just how one-sided this arrangement actually is. Rolex has terminated authorized dealer relationships, sometimes after decades of partnership, for reasons including discounting, for engaging with gray market inventory, or simply for failing to meet evolving standards the company sets unilaterally. Several of these terminations have resulted in lawsuits, filed by dealers who argued they'd invested enormous resources over years building their business around that Rolex relationship, only to have it revoked without the kind of negotiated exit or compensation a more balanced commercial partnership might include. Court filings from several of these disputes over the years have revealed details about exactly how tightly the contracts are written in Rolex's favor, including provisions letting the company terminate the relationship for a wide range of reasons with limited recourse for the dealer. A dealer who loses authorization doesn't just lose one product line, they often lose a significant share of the foot traffic and reputation building value that came from being able to display the Rolex name in their window, a value that, once lost, is not something a terminated dealer has any real leverage to negotiate back. Now let's talk about something genuinely different from most luxury scarcity strategies. Because this part isn't primarily about artificial restriction, it's about actual, self-imposed manufacturing discipline. Rolex produces roughly 1 million watches a year, a substantial number by luxury watchmaking standards, but a figure the company has deliberately not scaled dramatically, even as global demand has, by every available indicator, grown considerably faster than that production figure over the past decade. This is worth being precise about, because it would be inaccurate to claim Rolex could simply produce unlimited watches without any real constraint. Rolex manufactures the overwhelming majority of its own components in-house, movements, cases, bracelets, even its own gold alloys and steel formulations, an unusually vertically integrated manufacturing model compared to many competitors who source components from third-party suppliers, and vertical integration at this level does impose genuine capacity constraints that can't be solved simply by writing a larger check to outside manufacturers. But industry analysts have also noted repeatedly that Rolex could likely expand capacity further than it currently does through additional facility investment, and has chosen a more measured, incremental expansion pace instead, prioritizing consistency of quality control and, many analysts believe, the deliberate maintenance of demand outpacing supply over the kind of aggressive capacity expansion a publicly traded competitor facing shareholder pressure might feel compelled to pursue. This connects directly back to the ownership structure covered earlier. A public company watching a product category with demand this strong relative to supply would face enormous pressure to expand production and capture that unmet demand as revenue, because failing to do so would look to shareholders and analysts like leaving money on the table. Rolex, insulated from that pressure entirely, can make a different calculation, weighing long-term brand positioning and the value of sustained scarcity against the short-term revenue that faster expansion might capture, and consistently choosing the former. This is a genuinely rare position for a company of Rolex's size and global recognition to be in, and it's difficult to imagine a publicly traded company in the same position making the identical choice for as many consecutive decades as Rolex has. Let's talk about the waiting list itself, because this is the part most people actually encounter directly, and it operates differently than most people assume before they experience it firsthand. Walking into a Rolex authorized dealer and asking to be placed on a waiting list for a popular model doesn't function like a simple, transparent queue where the next person in line gets the next watch that arrives. Multiple dealers and industry commentators have described the actual process as considerably more relational and, to an outside observer, opaque, with allocation frequently influenced by a customer's purchase history with that specific dealer, their willingness to buy other, less sought-after watches or jewelry alongside the waiting list request, and the overall relationship they've built with a specific salesperson over time, sometimes over years of smaller purchases before ever being offered the specific watch they actually wanted. This has led to a widely discussed practice within watch collecting circles, sometimes described as needing to build a purchase history to earn access to the most desirable models, buying watches you may not have wanted as much, purely to demonstrate the kind of customer relationship that eventually gets rewarded with a call about the watch you actually came in for in the first place. This system, whatever its frustrations for an ordinary customer walking in cold, serves Rolex's broader strategic goals precisely because it reinforces the dealer relationship model the entire distribution structure depends on. A transparent, first come, first served digital waiting list would function more like ordinary e-commerce, reducing the dealer's role to little more than order fulfillment. The relationship-dependent version keeps the authorized dealer and the personal rapport a customer builds with that dealer central to the entire experience, reinforcing exactly the kind of in-person, relationship-driven retail model covered in a different context in an earlier discussion of luxury retail generally, applied here to the mechanics of an actual purchase rather than just the atmosphere of a showroom. Now, let's talk about the gray market, because this is where the gap between Rolex's controlled retail price and actual market demand becomes visible in hard numbers, and where an entire parallel economy has grown up around a scarcity strategy the company itself doesn't directly profit from, at least not until recently. Because official waiting lists for popular models can run into years, a substantial secondary market has developed where watches acquired through authorized dealers, sometimes by individuals with strong relationships and quick allocation, sometimes through less legitimate channels involving under-the-table payments to dealer staff, get resold, often almost immediately, at prices significantly above Rolex's own retail price. Certain steel sport models have, for extended periods, commanded resale premiums of many thousands of dollars over retail, sometimes doubling or more the original price for the most sought-after references. A phenomenon widely covered in watch collecting media and confirmed by pricing data from major watch resale platforms tracking these premiums over time. This creates a genuinely strange incentive structure worth examining directly. Rolex itself does not collect any of that resale premium under the traditional retail model. The company sold the watch once at its own set price, and everything that happens afterward on the secondary market is, in pure accounting terms, somebody else's profit entirely. And yet, this exact dynamic, the visible, well-documented gap between retail price and resale price, arguably does more to reinforce the brand's desirability and prestige than almost any advertising campaign could, because nothing signals genuine scarcity and demand more convincingly than watching people pay a substantial premium on the open market for an item the manufacturer itself is still selling, when it can at a lower official price. Rolex has taken active steps to police this dynamic on the dealer side, terminating authorized dealers found to be systematically supplying the gray market rather than genuine retail customers, treating this as a serious violation of the dealer agreement precisely because unchecked gray market supply from within the authorized network would undermine the perceived scarcity the entire waiting list system depends on for its psychological effect. A related layer to this operates internationally rather than just between official retail and gray market pricing within a single country. And it's worth understanding because it complicates the picture further. Rolex sets official retail prices market by market, adjusted for local currency and, in some cases, local import duties and taxes. But these adjustments don't always track exactly with real-time currency fluctuations, meaning at any given moment, the same watch can carry a meaningfully different effective price when converted to a common currency across different countries. This has created a long documented pattern of watch tourism and cross-border arbitrage. Buyers traveling to countries where the official retail price, once converted, sits noticeably below what the identical watch costs at home, sometimes justifying the cost of international travel purely through the savings on a single watch purchase, particularly for the higher value models. Some authorized dealers in popular tourist destinations have developed something close to a specialized business model around this exact dynamic, serving international visitors drawn by favorable currency conversion rather than relying primarily on domestic customer relationships the way a dealer in a less currency advantaged market typically would. Rolex has, at times, adjusted regional pricing in response to sustained arbitrage patterns like this, though the lag between currency movements and official price adjustments means the opportunity rarely disappears completely. It simply shifts to whichever market currently offers the most favorable conversion at a given moment. It's worth noting a relatively recent shift here, because the picture isn't entirely static. In 2022, Rolex launched a certified pre-owned program, officially authenticating and, through select authorized dealers, selling used Rolex watches with the company's own certification, a notable departure from decades of treating the secondary market as something happening entirely outside its control. This move, while limited in scope so far compared to the size of the broader gray market, suggests the company has recognized real value in participating in and to some degree formalizing at least part of the resale ecosystem its own scarcity strategy created, rather than leaving that entire value chain to independent resellers and gray market dealers who'd been capturing it for years with no involvement from Rolex at all. Rule 1. Understand that walking into a store with cash in hand for a popular current model is very unlikely to result in an immediate purchase, and treat any dealer promising a fast, guaranteed timeline for a genuinely in-demand reference with real skepticism, because the entire system is built around allocation scarcity that no individual salesperson can simply override on request. Rule 2. If you're serious about eventually acquiring a specific hard-to-get model through official channels, understand that building an actual relationship with one specific authorized dealer, visiting repeatedly, buying smaller items, being a pleasant and low-friction customer over an extended period, measurably improves your realistic odds, even though this isn't how the process is officially described. Rule 3. If you do consider the gray market, verify authenticity carefully through reputable, established resale platforms with real authentication processes, because the premium prices commanded by popular models have created a real incentive for counterfeit and fraud in less regulated corners of the resale market. And the financial stakes of getting that verification wrong are considerable. Rule 4. Recognize that the specific model you want may simply not be the model you actually get offered first, and that dealers frequently steer waiting list customers toward less sought after references that are actually available, which isn't necessarily bad faith. It's a genuine reflection of what allocation the dealer has actually received from Rolex that month. Rule 5. If resale value is a real consideration in your decision, understand that the models commanding the strongest resale premiums are generally the same steel sport models facing the longest official waiting list, meaning the exact features that make a watch hardest to acquire new are frequently the same features that make it hold or exceed its value on the secondary market later. Rule 6. Don't mistake the waiting list frustration for evidence that Rolex is failing to meet demand out of incompetence or poor planning, because the entire pattern, examined across decades and multiple product cycles, reflects a deliberate, strategic choice enabled by the company's unusual ownership structure, not an operational failure a normal, shareholder-pressured company would have already corrected. One reframe matters more than the rest here. Rolex's restricted distribution isn't a side effect of overwhelming demand the company simply can't keep up with. And it isn't pure manufactured illusion either, since real manufacturing discipline and genuine vertical integration constraints play a real role alongside the deliberate strategic choices. It's a carefully maintained system, made possible by an ownership structure that insulates the company from the growth pressure that would force almost any publicly traded competitor to expand distribution and ease scarcity long before Rolex ever has. The empty shelf space in an authorized dealer's display case and the years-long waiting list aren't signs of a company failing to capture available revenue. They're evidence of a company that decided, deliberately, decades ago, that the revenue it was leaving on the table was worth less than the scarcity it was preserving, and built an entire corporate structure so nobody could ever force it to reconsider that trade. 3 takeaways. 1. Rolex's private foundation ownership structure removes the shareholder growth pressure that drives nearly every publicly traded luxury competitor toward wider distribution, making restricted supply a sustainable long-term strategy rather than a temporary bottleneck. 2. The authorized dealer network functions as a tightly controlled, revocable privilege rather than an ordinary wholesale relationship, with strict contractual limits on discounting and gray market involvement enforced through termination, and allocation within that network often depends more on relationship history than on any transparent first come, first served waiting list. 3. The substantial gray market resale premiums commanded by certain models are a direct, predictable consequence of the deliberate scarcity strategy, and Rolex's 2022 move into certified pre-owned sales suggests the company has started recognizing real value in that secondary market it spent decades leaving entirely to independent resellers. Lazy investing built more fortune than chasing a hyped waiting list ever will. The people who actually navigate the system well aren't the ones showing up once with cash and frustration when a dealer says no. They're the ones who understood from the start that the relationship was always the actual product being sold, and the watch itself was simply what eventually arrived once that relationship had been built. If you want to see the exact guide I put together on building a real relationship with an authorized dealer from your very first visit, there's a walkthrough on my channel with the real details. No guesswork, just what actually works. Thanks for watching.